Welcome to our channel, dear friends, and thank you for joining me tonight. Wherever you are, whether you are curled up in bed, sipping tea in the dim light of your living room, or letting these words accompany you as you drift into sleep, I am honored to share this journey with you. Tonight, we are not following the polished legends of invincible warriors or heroic deaths sung in poetry. Instead, we are diving into the shadowed story of one man, a survivor, whose very survival challenged the deepest values of his people. This is the untold story of Aristodemus, the Spartan who lived when 300 others did not. But before we step into his world, let me ask you a question. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to be the only one left standing after everyone around you has fallen? Imagine the weight of that survival, not as a blessing, but as a curse. Imagine coming home not to cheers, but to silence, to turned backs, to whispers that sting sharper than Persian arrows. That was Aristodemus's fate, and tonight we will explore why survival, in Sparta, was sometimes considered worse than death. If stories like this captivate you, if you find peace in drifting off to sleep with history woven into tales of courage, shame, and redemption, then feel free to subscribe and leave a comment below. Share with us where you are listening from and what time of night it is. It is strangely comforting to know that across oceans and time zones, we are all connected through these stories. Now, let us step into the firelit halls of Sparta, into a world where death was not just inevitable, but often preferable, where a man's worth was measured not by how he lived, but by how he died. And in this world, Aristodemus would walk a path unlike any other. The story begins in the year 480 before Christ. The Persian Empire under King Xerxes has risen like a tidal wave, its armies vast, its ambitions boundless. Greece, fractured and often quarreling with itself, faced a threat that could erase its independence forever. Among the cities of Greece, none was more feared in battle than Sparta. Its warriors were raised from childhood to be instruments of war, to endure hunger, pain, and death with stoic silence. For a Spartan, glory was found not in survival, but in sacrifice. And so, when Xerxes marched with perhaps the largest army the ancient world had ever seen, it was Sparta that stepped forward. At the narrow pass of Thermopylae, King Leonidas led his 300 chosen warriors, supported by a few thousand allies from other Greek states. This was no ordinary force. These were men selected not just for their skill, but for their status as fathers of living sons, so that their family lines would continue even if they fell. Leonidas knew they would not return. They marched not to victory, but to death, determined to buy time for the rest of Greece to prepare. Among them was Aristodemus, a Spartan warrior like any other. But unlike his comrades, his fate would diverge in a way that no training, no oath, no tradition could have prepared him for. Herodotus, the ancient historian, tells us that Aristodemus was stricken with a severe eye infection as the battle loomed. His sight was failing, and with him was another Spartan, Eurytus, who suffered the same affliction. The two were ordered to withdraw from the front lines, sent away to recover. Imagine that moment. Two Spartans, men trained to fight until death, ordered instead to stand aside. But here is where their paths split. Eurytus, nearly blind, insisted on returning to the battlefield. He demanded to be led back, and though he could barely see, he charged into the fight and met his death among his comrades. Aristodemus, however, did not.
He lingered, perhaps too weak, perhaps too afraid, perhaps simply resigned to the reality that he could not fight. He lived while Eurytus died, and in that choice, or in that hesitation, his destiny was sealed. When the dust settled and the last Spartan had fallen at Thermopylae, Aristodemus returned to Sparta. One might imagine relief, or even quiet gratitude that at least one man had survived to tell the tale. But that was not the Spartan way. To survive when others died was not seen as fortune, but as failure. Aristodemus was met not with honors, but with scorn. His fellow Spartans gave him no welcome, no conversation. They refused to light a fire in his presence, refused to share a meal, refused even to speak his name. In a society that valued the collective over the individual, he became an outcast. Why? To understand this, we must step back and look at the culture of Sparta itself. For Spartans, honor was tied inseparably to death in battle. Their laws, their education, their very upbringing through the agage, the brutal training system that molded boys into warriors, drilled into them that fear was the greatest disgrace. To die in combat was the ultimate fulfillment of duty. To survive when one's comrades had perished was to betray that duty. And so Aristodemus was branded with the ultimate shame. He was not called Aristodemus the survivor. He was Aristodemus the coward. But was he truly a coward? Or was he simply a man who survived circumstances beyond his control? Was it cowardice to live, or was it human? These are questions that echo through time, and they remind us that the line between honor and survival is often drawn not by truth, but by culture, by the values a society chooses to uphold. And yet, Aristodemus's story does not end with disgrace. His survival was only the beginning of a longer journey, one that would take him to another battlefield, one that would offer him the chance to reclaim his honor or to lose it forever. That battlefield was Plataea, a year later, where the fate of Greece itself would hang once again in the balance. But before we reach Plataea, let us linger a little longer in Sparta, in the silence that surrounded Aristodemus, in the heavy weight of a culture that saw survival as worse than death. For it is here, in this silence, that the heart of his story beats. It is here that we find the true tension between what it means to be a hero and what it means simply to be human. When Aristodemus returned to Sparta after Thermopylae, the air he breathed was heavier than any battlefield. Sparta was not Athens, with its poets and its politics, where words might soothe wounds and survival could be painted as fortune. Sparta was a society of silence, steel, and unyielding expectations. To live when the rest had died was not an accident to be pitied, but a crime to be condemned. The Spartans had a word for men like Aristodemus, tremblers. In their language, a trembler was not just a man who shook with fear. It was someone whose very presence made others recoil. The punishment was not execution, not exile, not torture. It was something harsher. It was erasure. Aristodemus was not spoken to, not greeted, not even looked in the eye. He ate alone. He trained alone. When he walked through the agora, no one acknowledged his steps. He was alive, yes, but in a city where community meant everything, Aristodemus was already dead. This silence was not a momentary punishment. It was meant to last his life. In Sparta, shame was eternal. Their laws, shaped by the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, had no room for exceptions. For the Spartans, it was better that Aristodemus had fallen blind and bleeding at Thermopylae, like Eurytus, than to return and bring the stain of survival upon the city. And so Aristodemus endured.
Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months. His body healed, but the wound carved by dishonor only deepened. Imagine what it must have been like to walk the streets of your own city, the very city you were trained since boyhood to defend, and feel yourself vanish before the eyes of your fellow citizens. To sit in the Syssitia, the common mess where Spartan men shared meals, and find no one willing to share bread with you. To be surrounded by the echoes of Thermopylae, every name praised, every death honored, while your own name was spat like ash. Yet Aristodemus did not leave. He did not flee Sparta for Athens or Thebes or some distant colony. He stayed. That decision alone is remarkable. To remain in a city that denied him warmth, to continue living under the judgment of his peers, suggests a willpower we might not expect from the man Herodotus called a coward. Was it stubbornness? Was it hope? Or was it the faint knowledge that someday, somehow, there might be a chance to prove himself again? That chance would come, but not quickly. For outside of Sparta, Greece trembled. The Persians, though delayed by Thermopylae, still swept southward. They burned Athens, desecrated temples, and demanded submission. But Greece did not bow. At the Battle of Salamis, the Athenian navy, with cunning and courage, dealt a crushing blow to the Persian fleet. Yet the war was not over. Xerxes withdrew to Asia, but left behind a massive land army under his general Mardonius. The Persians were not defeated. They were merely waiting. And so the Greeks prepared. Sparta, Athens, Corinth, and many others, often rivals or outright enemies, united once more. They knew that one last decisive clash was coming. That clash would take place at Plataea in 479 before Christ, a year after Thermopylae. And Aristodemus, the coward, the outcast, the man who had endured a year of silence, would be there. Before we reach Plataea, let us linger a little longer on what this meant for Aristodemus. For most Spartans, the call to arms was a continuation of their lives. They were warriors by definition, men for whom battle was bread and water. But for Aristodemus, the battlefield was something else entirely. It was not duty. It was not necessity. It was the only path back to humanity. He had a choice. He could march with his fellow Spartans and fight as they did, steady and disciplined. Or he could throw himself into the fire of battle, reckless and unrestrained, determined to prove in one blaze of violence that he was not a coward, but a Spartan after all. History tells us he chose the latter. At Plataea, Aristodemus would fight not like a soldier, but like a man possessed. But let us not rush ahead. First, we must understand the broader stage of Plataea. The Greek coalition was fragile. Athens wanted to lead, but Sparta held command of the land forces. Mistrust simmered even as the Persians loomed. The Persians, meanwhile, sought to divide the Greeks, offering bribes and promises to those who wavered. It was not just a war of spears, but of loyalties, a test of whether Greece could stand together long enough to survive. In this storm of politics, Aristodemus's personal storm boiled quietly. For a year, he had been the embodiment of shame. Now, as he marched with the Spartan army toward Plataea, he must have felt the eyes of his comrades upon him, not in camaraderie, not in trust, but in suspicion. Would he tremble again? Would he falter when the Persian tide broke upon them? Or would he finally prove himself worthy of the shield he bore? Plataea was not Thermopylae. It was not a desperate stand against impossible odds. It was a chance for Greece to strike back, to destroy the Persian army once and for all.
Tens of thousands of Greeks assembled. The Persians matched them in number, perhaps surpassed them. The plain of Plataea, wide and open, would become a crucible of nations. And in that crucible, Aristodemus burned. Herodotus tells us that when the battle came, Aristodemus did not hold the line in the steady, disciplined way that Spartans were trained to fight. Instead, he hurled himself forward, seeking death as eagerly as his comrades once had sought victory. He fought with such fury that no one could question his courage. He slew, he struck, he pushed beyond the front ranks. To his fellow Spartans, his charge was not bravery, but desperation, not valor, but madness. And here lies the paradox of Aristodemus. At Thermopylae, he was condemned for living. At Plataea, he was condemned again, this time for fighting too fiercely, for seeking death rather than holding discipline. Sparta demanded a precise balance. To die was honorable, to live was shameful, but to throw away one's life recklessly was also wrong. Aristodemus, caught between these demands, could never win. He was too human for Sparta's code, too flawed to fit into its rigid mold. But in death at Plataea, Aristodemus found something he had been denied in life. He fell in battle, drenched in blood, his name no longer a whisper of shame, but a story to be told. Some Spartans criticized his frenzy, saying he had not fought with proper order. Yet none could deny that he had fought, that he had faced the Persians without flinching, that he had embraced the fate he had once turned away from. Was he redeemed? Perhaps not in the eyes of all Spartans. But in the sweep of history, Aristodemus stands as something rare. A survivor whose survival did not end in comfort or triumph, but in a desperate struggle to reconcile humanity with a culture that demanded perfection. He was not Leonidas, the lion of Thermopylae, nor Eurytus, the blind martyr.
He was Aristodemus, the man who lived, and because he lived, we are reminded that survival is not always simple, not always sweet. Sometimes it is the heaviest burden of all. As we look upon his story, let us remember the broader picture. Sparta's laws and traditions forged men of iron, but they also left little space for weakness, for chance, for the unpredictability of life. Aristodemus embodies that tension. He shows us that behind every legend of 300 warriors standing to the last, there is the quieter story of the one who did not fall, who bore the weight of being left behind. And so, when the dust of Plataea settled, when the Persians were routed and Greece had secured its freedom, Aristodemus was gone. His story ended not in glory sung by poets, nor in statues raised by grateful cities, but in the shadows of judgment, in the uneasy memory of a society that could not decide whether to call him coward or hero. Yet here we are, more than 2 millennia later, speaking his name. Perhaps that, in the end, is its own form of redemption. The morning of Plataea dawned clear, the kind of morning when the air carries the quiet tension of something about to break. For days, the Greeks and Persians had faced each other across the plain, each side wary, each waiting for the other to move first. The Persians were confident, their cavalry strong, their numbers vast. The Greeks were cautious, their unity fragile, their supplies strained. Among the tens of thousands who stood in the Greek ranks, the Spartans formed the heart, the steady line upon which the fate of the coalition rested. And within that line stood Aristodemus. He had marched with them from Sparta, carrying not just his shield and spear, but the invisible weight of every turned back, every whispered accusation, every cold silence he had endured in the year since Thermopylae. For his comrades, the battle was a duty. For him, it was something more.
It was a chance to carve his name not as Aristodemus the coward, but as Aristodemus the avenger, the man who returned from the shadow of shame to embrace fire and death. Herodotus, our most detailed source, tells us that when the fighting began, Aristodemus fought like a man possessed. Unlike the disciplined precision expected of Spartans, who moved as one, holding formation, advancing and retreating like the blades of a single weapon, Aristodemus broke free of the rhythm. He hurled himself forward with a ferocity that shocked even his comrades. He fought not for survival, but for obliteration, for the chance to erase with blood the stain that silence had written upon his life. To the Persians who faced him, Aristodemus must have seemed like a storm. Blind rage, wild courage, every strike carrying the desperation of a man who sought not victory, but redemption through death. He killed, and he killed again. He pressed so hard into the enemy lines that some Spartans muttered he endangered the cohesion of their formation. Yet none could deny that his fury tore open paths through the Persian front, that his spear and sword struck as though the gods themselves had filled his limbs with fire. And then, at last, he fell. Cut down not in retreat, not in fear, but in the heart of battle, surrounded by the dead he had made, his own body broken in the frenzy of his assault. Aristodemus was gone. He had sought death, and death had found him. But what then was he in the eyes of Sparta? The answer is complicated. For some, Aristodemus had redeemed himself. He had chosen the only path left to him, a path of violent courage, and he had walked it to the end. No one could say he had trembled at Plataea. No one could call him a coward in that moment. For others, however, his frenzy was not Spartan, but un-Spartan. It lacked the discipline, the calm unity, the measured steadiness that defined true Spartan valor. He had not fought like a Spartan. He had fought like a desperate man, reckless, consumed by personal need rather than collective order. Here lies the cruel irony. At Thermopylae, Aristodemus was condemned for living. At Plataea, he was criticized for how he died. He could never fit perfectly into the rigid mold of Spartan honor. His survival made him flawed, his redemption too wild to be fully embraced. In life, he bore shame. In death, he bore ambiguity. Yet, for us, centuries later, Aristodemus is not simply a cautionary tale. He is something more compelling, a reminder that history is not made only of flawless heroes. It is made of men caught between expectation and reality, between the ideals of their society and the instincts of survival. Aristodemus is human in a story that so often feels superhuman. Let us pause here and consider Eurytus, his companion at Thermopylae, who also suffered from blindness. Eurytus chose to return to battle, demanding to be led back, and died alongside Leonidas and the others. Sparta honored him, though his blindness had made him nearly useless in combat. To them, it was not the effectiveness of his fight that mattered, but the choice, the willingness to die rather than live. In choosing death, he preserved his honor. Aristodemus, in choosing life, lost his. And yet, what if we shift our perspective? What if survival, far from being dishonorable, was the more difficult path? What if Aristodemus's shame and isolation required more courage than the quick certainty of death at Thermopylae? To live among your people as a ghost, to endure their contempt, to rise each morning under the weight of silence, that is its own kind of battlefield. Aristodemus walked that battlefield for a year before Plataea gave him release. And what of Leonidas, the king who chose to die at Thermopylae? His death was immortalized, his name sung for centuries as the embodiment of Spartan valor. But Leonidas was a king. His sacrifice was symbolic, necessary, even strategic. He chose death knowing it would inspire Greece to stand. Aristodemus had no such grandeur. His life was not part of a legend, but a mistake, a fracture in the perfect narrative of Spartan glory. And perhaps that is why his story matters so deeply. He is the imperfection that makes the myth real. Plataea itself was a turning point in the Greco-Persian Wars. The Greeks, united at last, fought with ferocity. The Spartans held their ground, the Athenians pressed the flanks, and the Persians, despite their numbers, faltered. Mardonius, the Persian commander, was killed, and his army scattered. With that victory, Greece secured its independence. The Persian dream of domination in Europe ended on that field. Thermopylae had been a noble defeat. Salamis had been a brilliant naval strike. But Plataea was the final blow, the victory that gave meaning to all the sacrifices before.
And somewhere in the midst of that great battle lay Aristodemus, nameless in the chorus of fallen warriors, yet remembered because his life had been an exception. He was not the perfect Spartan. He was not the model of obedience and discipline, but he was real. His story survives not because it was convenient, but because it was inconvenient. Not because it fit the legend, but because it broke it. For historians, Aristodemus raises important questions. Was he truly a coward? Or was he simply a victim of circumstance, judged harshly by a society that allowed no room for chance? Was his desperate charge at Plataea madness? Or was it the only way left for him to reconcile himself with the values of his people? The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. For us today, Aristodemus can be seen in another light. In a world that often celebrates the flawless hero, he reminds us that survival is not always glorious, but it is deeply human. He reminds us that shame and redemption are not fixed, but fluid, shifting with the eyes of those who judge us. He reminds us that history is not just the story of kings and generals, but of men who lived through contradictions, whose lives could not be neatly wrapped in legend. And so, as we look back on Aristodemus, we can call him many things: a coward, a survivor, a man who broke under pressure, a man who rose again in fury. But above all, we can call him what he truly was: human. In that humanity, he speaks across the centuries to us more clearly than the perfect martyrs ever could. When you think of the 300 at Thermopylae, you might imagine a wall of bronze shields, spears bristling, men who never wavered, never doubted, never feared. But if you also remember Aristodemus, then you remember that even in Sparta, even in the hardest city of the ancient world, there was room, unwilling perhaps, but undeniable, for imperfection. And that imperfection tells us more about what it means to be human than all the legends of perfect sacrifice combined. Aristodemus's story closes not with triumph, nor with disgrace, but with a question that lingers. What does it truly mean to be brave? Is it to die without hesitation? Or is it to live with the burden of survival, to endure shame, to fight again, even when the world calls you coward? Each of us may answer differently, but perhaps in the quiet hours of the night, when legends fade and humanity remains, we can hear Aristodemus whisper, "Sometimes surviving is the hardest battle of all." To understand fully why Aristodemus's survival cut so deeply against the grain of Spartan society, we must step back and look at the fabric of that society itself. Sparta was not merely another Greek city-state. It was an experiment in discipline, in collective identity, in shaping human beings into instruments of the state. Every Spartan boy entered the agoge, the brutal training system that tore children from their families at the age of 7 and raised them in barracks under relentless discipline. Their lives were defined by obedience, endurance, and above all, the eradication of fear. Fear for a Spartan was worse than death. Death in battle was not an ending, but a fulfillment. A Spartan mother, according to tradition, gave her son his shield with the words, "Return with it or on it." That phrase captures the essence of their values. A warrior should return either victorious, carrying his shield, or dead, borne back upon it. To flee, to lose the shield, to survive dishonorably, these were the ultimate betrayals. And so Aristodemus's survival was not judged by the circumstances of his illness, but by the simple fact that he returned alive when others had not. In Sparta, there was no allowance for misfortune. Fate was to be embraced, not excused. That rigidity was both Sparta's strength and its cruelty. It produced warriors who could stand at Thermopylae without flinching. It also left no room for men like Aristodemus, whose survival was marked not by choice, but by chance. Yet not all Greece shared this view. Athens, for instance, prized courage, yes, but also cunning, adaptability, and above all, the survival of the city. An Athenian might admire clever retreat as much as noble death. Themistocles, the Athenian general who orchestrated the naval victory at Salamis, was not celebrated for dying bravely, but for outsmarting the Persians, for ensuring his city endured. For Athenians, survival could be a form of victory. Thebes and Corinth, too, held different values. They admired valor, but they did not bind their citizens in the same unyielding code of honor that Sparta demanded. For them, a man who lived to fight again was not a shame, but an asset. In this way, Aristodemus's story becomes even more striking. In most Greek cities, his survival might have been forgiven, even understood. Only in Sparta did it become an indelible stain. This contrast tells us something essential about Greek culture. Though united by language, religion, and a sense of shared identity, the Greek poli, the city-states, were deeply diverse in their values. Sparta represented the extreme of communal discipline. Athens represented the extreme of individual brilliance. Corinth, Thebes, and others occupied spaces in between. Together, they formed a mosaic in which Aristodemus's survival could mean dishonor in one city and resilience in another. But here is where Aristodemus's story becomes necessary for history. If all we remembered of Thermopylae were the deaths, the sacrifice, the unbroken wall of bronze shields, then we would have only myth, a tale of perfect courage with no cracks. Aristodemus is the crack. He is the reminder that even in the most disciplined society, even under the harshest codes, survival happens. And when it happens, it raises questions that myths prefer to silence. Was Aristodemus less of a man because he lived? Was Eurytus greater because he chose to stumble blindly into death? Was Leonidas noble because he died as king, or would he have been condemned too had he somehow survived? These are not easy questions, and Sparta did not want to ask them. But Aristodemus forced them into existence. His very presence was a challenge to the clarity of the Spartan worldview. And in that challenge lies the deeper value of his story. For what is history if not the record of human imperfection? Legends give us ideals, but history gives us truth.
Aristodemus lived not as a flawless hero, but as a flawed man caught in impossible circumstances. By remembering him, we remember that even in Sparta, humanity could not be entirely erased. It is worth reflecting, too, on how later generations may have viewed Aristodemus. Herodotus, writing decades after the Persian Wars, preserves his story with both sympathy and judgment. He calls him a coward, but he also records his frenzied courage at Plataea. That duality, coward and avenger, ensures that Aristodemus is not forgotten. His name, unlike the thousands who died anonymously in the wars, survives precisely because it was contested. In a way, Aristodemus's survival serves as a counterweight to the Spartan myth. The legend of the 300 has been polished for centuries into a story of perfect sacrifice, used by poets, politicians, and even modern films to symbolize unwavering courage. But Aristodemus reminds us that the reality was more complex. Behind the bronze helmets and crimson cloaks were men, fallible and vulnerable. Some died gloriously. One lived shamefully. Both truths are needed if we are to see the full picture. The cultural weight of honor and death in Sparta also echoes into later history. Rome, centuries after, admired Sparta and often invoked its discipline as a model. Yet even the Romans allowed for survival, retreat, and cunning in ways Sparta would not. When Roman legions retreated and regrouped, they could still win honor in later battles. For Sparta, such pragmatism was unthinkable. Aristodemus was the casualty of that absolutism. Let us imagine for a moment if Sparta had chosen differently. If Aristodemus had been welcomed home not with silence but with compassion. If his survival had been seen as fortune rather than disgrace, how might his story have changed? Perhaps he would have trained the next generation, telling them of Thermopylae not as myth but as memory. Perhaps his humanity would have softened the edges of Spartan rigidity. But that was not Sparta. Compassion had no place in their laws. And so Aristodemus bore the weight alone. Yet across the centuries, his story resonates precisely because it resists perfection. To us, living in a world where survival often carries its own burdens, Aristodemus feels closer than Leonidas. We may admire the king's sacrifice, but we understand the survivor's shame. We know what it is to live when others have fallen, to wonder why fate chose us and not them. Aristodemus becomes not just a Spartan, but a mirror for all who have carried the weight of survival. This is why his story matters. This is why, when we speak of Thermopylae, we should not speak only of the 300 who died, but also of the one who lived. Without Aristodemus, the legend would be smooth, untouchable, almost divine. With him, it becomes human. And humanity, flawed and fragile, is what connects us to the past. As the Persian Wars ended and Greece entered a new age of rivalry, the memory of Thermopylae grew brighter with each retelling. Leonidas became a symbol. The 300 became martyrs. But Aristodemus lingered at the edges, a shadow in the light of legend. Some cursed his name, others pitied him. Still others saw in him the complexity that legends cannot hold. And perhaps that complexity is his true gift to us. For in the end, Aristodemus shows us that courage is not a single act, not a simple choice between life and death. Courage can be living through shame. Courage can be bearing silence. Courage can be fighting again, even when the world calls you coward. His life forces us to ask, is bravery only found in dying gloriously, or can it also be found in surviving painfully? The Spartans gave one answer. History gives another. And we, listening tonight across centuries, must decide for ourselves. When we imagine Aristodemus walking through the streets of Sparta, we often think first of how others saw him: coward, trembler, disgrace. But let us pause and think about how Aristodemus must have seen himself. What was it like to wake each morning knowing you had lived where your brothers had died? To feel the weight of thousands of eyes refusing to meet yours? To carry the memory of Thermopylae not as glory, but as a wound that never healed? Modern psychology gives us words for what Aristodemus likely endured: survivor's guilt. It is the heavy, corrosive feeling that arises when someone survives a disaster, a battle, or a tragedy while others do not. Soldiers returning from war often describe it as the hardest burden to bear, not the injuries, not the nightmares, but the simple question: why did I live when they died? Aristodemus lived that question every day. Consider the details. He had not chosen to abandon his comrades. He had been struck with illness, blinded by infection, ordered to withdraw. And yet, in the Spartan mind, the cause mattered less than the outcome. He lived. Eurytus died. One was honored, the other disgraced. The logic of the society left no room for nuance, no room for Aristodemus to explain or defend himself. He was condemned not for what he had done, but for what he had not done. We can imagine, perhaps, how those days unfolded. Aristodemus waking in the dawn light, hearing the clatter of training in the fields, and knowing that his place among the men was no longer secure. Sitting in the Syssitia, the communal mess, and finding no one willing to share bread or wine. Walking past mothers who had lost sons at Thermopylae, feeling their eyes burn into his back with unspoken accusation: why him and not mine? That is the essence of survivor's guilt. It is not rational. Aristodemus could not have chosen blindness, could not have undone the infection. And yet, guilt is not born from logic. It is born from comparison, from the unbearable contrast between the living and the dead. Modern soldiers know this feeling well. After battles in Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, and countless other wars, veterans have spoken of lying awake at night, haunted not by the enemy, but by the faces of comrades who did not come home. Survivors of disasters, plane crashes, earthquakes, terrorist attacks, speak of the same weight. They ask the same questions Aristodemus must have asked. Why me? What does my survival mean when others did not survive? In the language of today, Aristodemus may also have suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Though the term is modern, the condition is ancient. The sleepless nights, the sudden flashbacks, the isolation, the anger turned inward, these are not new. Greek literature itself hints at them. Homer's Achilles rages in grief after the death of Patroclus. Ajax, in Sophocles' play, descends into despair and takes his own life when honor and shame collide. These are echoes of trauma, carried through myth and tragedy. Aristodemus, too, carried trauma, but unlike Achilles or Ajax, he was given no stage on which to express it, no audience for his grief. He was silenced. And silence can be the heaviest prison of all. Imagine the loneliness of Aristodemus's days. He had survived, but survival without community is a hollow thing. Spartans thrived on unity, on the bond of the phalanx, where each man's shield protected the man beside him. For Aristodemus, that bond was severed. His shield no longer protected anyone. His survival had stripped him of the very identity that made him Spartan. It is no wonder, then, that at Plataea, Aristodemus fought like a man possessed. To modern eyes, his charge looks like recklessness, but to one who has carried survivor's guilt, it looks like release. It was not merely courage, it was an act of desperation, of purging, of throwing himself so completely into the fire that no one could doubt his resolve again. For Aristodemus, Plataea was not just a battlefield, it was a stage on which to silence the voices that had haunted him since Thermopylae. And yet, even then, Sparta found fault. His frenzy, they said, was un-Spartan. Discipline was the highest virtue, and Aristodemus had abandoned it. The irony is sharp. In surviving Thermopylae, he was condemned for cowardice. In dying at Plataea, he was condemned for excess. He could never fit the exacting mold of his society's expectations. He was too human for Sparta's iron codes. But perhaps that is why Aristodemus matters to us today. For in his humanity we see ourselves. We know what it is to live with imperfection, to carry burdens that others cannot see, to wrestle with the weight of choices and accidents beyond our control. Aristodemus is not the flawless hero of legend. He is the flawed survivor, and that makes him real. His story also reminds us that societies often punish survivors more harshly than they honor them. Think of soldiers who return from war and find not gratitude but indifference, not community but isolation. Think of survivors of disasters who face suspicion, who are asked why they lived, why they did not save more. The world sometimes demands from survivors an impossible purity, a flawless narrative of bravery. But survival is messy. It always has been. Aristodemus lived that truth in the starkest of ways. In this light, Aristodemus can be seen not as a coward, but as a pioneer. He embodied the contradictions that war creates. He stood at the intersection of myth and reality, showing us that the stories we tell about glory and honor often leave no room for the complicated, painful truth of survival. His name lingers not because he fit the legend, but because he broke it. And so, when we look back on Aristodemus, we can also look forward to ourselves. How do we treat survivors today? Do we honor their endurance, or do we judge their imperfection? Do we allow them space to grieve, to stumble, to find their own path to meaning? Or do we demand from them the same impossible perfection that Sparta demanded from Aristodemus? His story, though ancient, asks these questions with urgency. For the battlefield may change. Persian arrows may become artillery shells, bronze shields may become Kevlar vests, but the burden of survival remains the same. Aristodemus's silence in Sparta echoes in the silence of veterans today, in the unspoken pain of those who live when others do not. His desperate charge at Plataea echoes in the struggles of survivors who seek meaning in action, sometimes reckless, sometimes misunderstood. And perhaps that is the final paradox of Aristodemus. He was condemned by his people, but in his condemnation, he speaks more powerfully to us than the heroes who fit perfectly into their society's myths. His imperfection is his gift. It bridges the gap between the bronze-clad warriors of ancient Greece and the fragile, resilient humans of every age. So when you hear of Thermopylae, remember not only the king who died, not only the blind warrior who chose death, but also the man who lived, who bore silence, who fought again, and who reminds us still that survival is never simple. Remember Aristodemus, the survivor of the 300. If Aristodemus had died at Thermopylae, his name would likely have been lost among the many. He would have been one more shield in the wall, one more body beneath the Persian tide. His survival, paradoxically, is what secured his place in history. And yet, that place is uneasy, shadowed, and often neglected. To understand why, we must turn to the historian who preserved his story, Herodotus. Herodotus, writing in the mid-5th century before Christ, is often called the father of history. He sought not only to record events, but to explain them, to capture the causes and choices behind the great wars between Greece and Persia. His account of Thermopylae is one of his most famous passages, a tale that has resonated through centuries. In his telling, Leonidas and the 300 Spartans stand as paragons of courage, martyrs for freedom. Their deaths become almost sacred, the foundation of a legend that would inspire Greece and beyond. But Herodotus does not ignore Aristodemus. In fact, he mentions him explicitly, and it is here that we find the tension. Herodotus tells us that Aristodemus was stricken with illness and sent away with another Spartan, Eurytus. He notes that Eurytus, though nearly blind, demanded to be led back into the battle, where he perished. Aristodemus, however, did not. And for that choice, or lack of choice, he was branded a coward. Herodotus's account is striking for its judgment. He does not soften the label. He calls Aristodemus a coward outright, even while acknowledging the circumstances. And yet, in the same breath, he records Aristodemus's frenzied valor at Plataea, where he fought and died with unmatched ferocity. The contradiction is unresolved. Aristodemus is both coward and hero, disgraced survivor and avenging warrior. Why did Herodotus preserve this ambiguity?
Perhaps because it was too well known to ignore. Spartan society itself could not erase Aristodemus. His survival was a fact. And so Herodotus, ever the collector of stories, recorded both the condemnation and the redemption. He leaves us not with a clear verdict, but with a tension that has endured for centuries. In the memory of the Greeks, however, the tension tilted heavily toward condemnation. Sparta's narrative power was immense, and in their eyes, Aristodemus was forever marked. The collective memory of Thermopylae preferred the simplicity of noble death. Aristodemus complicated that simplicity, and so his story, though preserved, was rarely celebrated. This selective memory is not unique to Sparta. Societies often choose to remember the heroes who fit their ideals and to silence those who do not. The Athenians remembered Themistocles as a brilliant strategist, though later they ostracized him when his ambition threatened the city. The Romans remembered Horatius, who defended the bridge, but not the countless soldiers who fled before him. Human memory, collective memory, is shaped not only by truth, but by usefulness. And Aristodemus, frankly, was not useful. His story undermined the clean lines of the Thermopylae legend. To admit that one Spartan lived, dishonored, was to admit that even in Sparta, imperfection existed. And so, across the centuries, his name faded into the margins, while Leonidas and the 300 became immortalized. This pattern has continued into modern times. Consider how Thermopylae is remembered today. In books, in speeches, in films, the story is retold as one of perfect sacrifice. The movie 300, for instance, presents a vision of Spartans as flawless warriors, fearless and unyielding. Leonidas dies with cinematic grandeur. His men follow him into glory, and their memory becomes eternal. In such a story, there is no room for Aristodemus.
A survivor would only disrupt the myth, raise uncomfortable questions. And so he is absent, erased, not by malice, but by the desire for a cleaner narrative. This erasure matters because it shows us how legends are constructed. Thermopylae, as we often hear it, is not history. It is mythologized history, sharpened into a symbol. Symbols need clarity. They thrive on absolutes. 300 men who died without flinching, that is a powerful symbol. 300 men plus one survivor who lived in shame, that is messy, complicated, too human. And so Aristodemus is quietly set aside.
But when we look closer, when we return to Herodotus and to the messy reality, Aristodemus emerges as perhaps the most human figure of the entire story. Leonidas is a king, a legend, a symbol larger than life. The 300 are martyrs, faceless in their collective sacrifice. Aristodemus is different. He is not larger than life. He is life itself, flawed, fragile, contradictory. He lived, he was shamed, he fought, he died. His story reminds us that behind every legend there are human beings who did not fit the script. And perhaps that is why we should remember him. Not to diminish Leonidas or the 300, but to complete them. To acknowledge that Thermopylae was not only about perfect courage, but also about human imperfection. Aristodemus forces us to see the cracks in the marble, the truth behind the myth. In this way, his story carries a lesson not just for historians, but for all of us. We live in a world that often polishes its heroes, turning them into icons without flaw. We tell stories of perfect soldiers, perfect leaders, perfect martyrs. But perfection is not truth.
Truth lies in the cracks, in the survivors, in the men and women who stumble, who falter, who endure shame and still find the courage to fight again. Aristodemus belongs to that truth. It is worth asking, what if we remembered Aristodemus more fully? What if his story were told alongside Leonidas's, not as an exception, but as part of the whole? The legend of the 300 would not be weakened. It would be deepened. It would remind us that courage is not always clean, that survival can be as harrowing as death, that humanity is not diminished by imperfection, but revealed by it. Aristodemus stands as a testament to the power of inconvenient memory. He was inconvenient to Sparta, inconvenient to legend, inconvenient even to modern storytellers. But in his inconvenience, he is honest. And honesty, more than perfection, is what binds history to our lives. So the next time you hear Thermopylae invoked as a symbol, whether in a history book, a film, or a speech, pause and remember the name Aristodemus. Remember the man who lived when others died, who bore shame and silence, who fought again and died in fury. Remember that history is not only about the heroes we polish, but also about the survivors we try to forget. Because in truth, Aristodemus is not a footnote. He is the reminder that legends are built on human lives, and human lives are never simple. In many ways, the story of Aristodemus reads like a Greek tragedy. Not a tragedy of kings or gods, but of an ordinary man caught between fate and choice, between the demands of his society and the fragile instincts of survival. Like the heroes of Sophocles or Euripides, Aristodemus did not simply live or die. He lived in shame, and then he died in fury. His life became a stage upon which the deepest contradictions of Greek thought played out. To understand this, we must look at the role of heroic death in Greek culture. For the Greeks, and especially for the Spartans, death in battle was not merely an end. It was a transformation, a way of entering memory, of becoming more than a man. When Leonidas fell at Thermopylae, he ceased to be only a king. He became a symbol of resistance, a legend for all time. Death purified his story, leaving no room for ambiguity. He chose sacrifice, and in that choice, his name became immortal. Aristodemus, however, complicates this ideal. He lived, and in living, he exposed the uncomfortable truth that survival is messy, uncertain, morally ambiguous. His existence after Thermopylae forced Sparta to confront questions it would rather avoid. If a man survives through no fault of his own, is he guilty? If honor demands death, Does chance have no place in human affairs? This tension echoes the themes of Greek tragedy. In Sophocles' Ajax, the great warrior feels dishonored when the prize of Achilles' armor is given to Odysseus. In his shame, Ajax falls into despair, ultimately taking his own life. His story asks, is a man's worth determined by his deeds or by how others judge them? Aristodemus' story asks the same. Was his survival dishonorable because of his actions or because of how Sparta chose to interpret them? Euripides often wrote of mortals trapped by forces beyond their control, punished not for their choices but for the whims of gods or fate. Aristodemus, too, was caught by fate, struck with illness, blinded, unable to fight. And yet, like the characters of Euripides, he was judged as though he had chosen freely. His tragedy was not his survival alone, but the impossibility of explaining it within the rigid logic of Spartan honor. Greek philosophy, too, wrestled with these questions. Heraclitus wrote that character is destiny. For the Spartans, this was literal. A man's character was revealed in whether he stood or fell in battle. But Aristodemus complicates that maxim. His destiny was not forged by his character, but by circumstance, by sickness, by blindness. Does that make his survival less valid? Or does it show that fate, not character, often decides who lives and who dies? Plato, in his dialogues, often asked what it means to live a good life. For Sparta, the answer was simple. A good life was one that ended honorably in battle. But for Plato, the question was larger. Is it better to suffer injustice than to commit it? Is it better to die nobly than to live shamefully? Aristodemus embodies that very dilemma. He lived shamefully, at least in the eyes of his peers, but was that worse than dying blindly at Thermopylae like Eurytus? The answer is not clear. The tragedy of Aristodemus lies in this ambiguity. In a society that demanded clarity, hero or coward, life or death, he was neither. He lived when he should have died. He died when he could not live. He became a contradiction, and contradictions are the essence of tragedy. Consider also how Aristodemus' story mirrors the structure of a Greek tragic play. In Act I, he is introduced as one of the 300, standing with his king, ready to die. In Act II, fate strikes. Illness blinds him, and he is sent away. The chorus of Sparta condemns him. In Act III, the climax arrives. At Plataea, Aristodemus hurls himself into battle, fighting with wild desperation, seeking redemption. In the final act, he falls, not as a hero, not as a coward, but as a man consumed by the weight of his own survival. His story ends not in glory, but in unresolved tension, leaving the audience to ponder what his life meant. And here we find the brilliance of Aristodemus' tale. Unlike Leonidas, whose story is simple and clear, Aristodemus resists resolution. He forces us to sit with discomfort, to acknowledge that human lives rarely fit neatly into categories. His survival raises questions that echo beyond Sparta, beyond Greece, into every society that has ever glorified death in war. What does it mean to honor the dead but scorn the living? What does it mean to praise sacrifice but ignore survival? What does it mean when a man's worth is judged not by what he endured, but by how his endurance failed to match an ideal? These are questions not only for the Greeks, but for us. In every war, there are survivors who return not to parades, but to silence, who bear not medals, but guilt. Aristodemus' story is their story. He is the ancient face of survivors' guilt, the timeless voice of those who lived when others died. His tragedy is not that he survived. His tragedy is that his society could not forgive him for it. In this way, Aristodemus is not only a character of history, but a character of philosophy. He embodies the clash between nomos, the law, the custom, the rigid code of society, and physis, the natural reality of human life, fragile and unpredictable. Sparta demanded nomos, death in battle or shame in survival. Aristodemus embodied physis, sickness, chance, the messiness of life.
His existence revealed the gap between law and life, and in that gap lies the essence of tragedy. Even Aristotle, who later analyzed tragedy in his Poetics, described how tragic characters often fall not because of vice, but because of hamartia, a flaw, a mistake, or simply a twist of fate. Aristodemus fits this mold. His flaw was not cowardice, but circumstance. Yet that circumstance became his doom. He is a tragic hero not because he chose wrongly, but because no choice he made could satisfy both fate and society. And so, Aristodemus stands alongside the great tragic figures of Greek thought. Like Oedipus, he is caught between fate and responsibility. Like Ajax, he is crushed by shame and seeks release in death. Like Heracles, he endures trials beyond the capacity of most men, only to find no peace in the end. His life, though rarely staged, is a tragedy as profound as any written by Sophocles or Euripides. For us, his story is a reminder that history is not only about victories and defeats, but about the human condition. Aristodemus teaches us that survival can be as heavy as death, that shame can be as destructive as wounds, that the human heart is often caught between ideals and reality. He is the flaw in the armor of Sparta, and because of that flaw, we see not only bronze and discipline, but flesh and blood. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of Aristodemus. In a world that often demands clarity, heroes and villains, victories and losses, martyrs and cowards, he reminds us that life is rarely so neat. He forces us to confront the ambiguity of survival, the tragedy of imperfection, the humanity that lies beneath the legend.
When we step back from the plains of Plataea and the shadows of Sparta, we begin to see Aristodemus not just as a Spartan figure, but as part of a much larger human story. His burden, his shame, his desperate need for redemption, these are not unique to ancient Greece. Across centuries and continents, soldiers and survivors have carried the same weight. They have endured the same whispers, the same silences, the same gnawing question, why did I live when others died? Consider the soldiers of the First World War. In 1916, at the Battle of the Somme, hundreds of thousands perished in the mud and smoke. Those who returned often did so broken, haunted by the images of comrades lost. Some were called heroes, yes, but many faced suspicion. In Britain, a culture that still glorified the clean sacrifice of earlier wars, men who survived with visible wounds were called heroes, while those who survived with invisible ones, shell shock, trauma, the inability to fight again, were often called cowards. They were court-martialed, punished, even executed for desertion, though today we would recognize them as victims of PTSD. Is that not the same cruel paradox that Aristodemus faced? He had survived, but his survival did not match the expectations of his society. To the Spartans, blindness was no excuse. To the British generals, trauma was no excuse. In both cases, the human reality of survival clashed with the rigid demands of military honor. In the Second World War, too, similar patterns emerged. The story of Dunkirk is remembered as one of courage and endurance, but for years, British leaders feared it might be seen as cowardice, an evacuation rather than a victory. The men who came home were haunted by a sense that their survival was not glorious but shameful, that they had left behind comrades in the sands of France. Some carried that guilt for decades. American veterans of Vietnam speak in similar tones. They came home not to parades, but to protests, their survival entwined with political controversy. Many felt not pride, but shame, a shame imposed by a society that struggled to make sense of the war. Survival, once again, became complicated, messy, morally entangled. The soldier who lived was not always honored. Sometimes he was shunned, much like Aristodemus walking the streets of Sparta. And in more recent decades, soldiers returning from Iraq and Afghanistan have described the same burden. They speak of brothers in arms who died in ambushes, in IED blasts, in firefights. They remember the faces, the names, the moments of loss. And they ask themselves again and again, why did I live when he did not? Why was I spared? Survivor's guilt does not change across centuries. It whispers the same torment, whether in bronze armor or desert camouflage. Aristodemus, then, is not only a Spartan. He is a symbol for all who have borne the weight of survival. His story, though rooted in the rigid codes of Sparta, resonates far beyond it. For in every war, in every disaster, there are survivors who face the same question, who feel the same isolation. Aristodemus's silence in Sparta echoes in the silence of veterans who cannot speak of what they endured, in the silence of survivors who cannot find words to explain why they lived. But Aristodemus also teaches us something about society itself. He shows us that communities often struggle to handle survival. They know how to honor the dead, to build monuments, to sing songs, to tell stories of sacrifice. But they are less comfortable with the living, especially the living who do not fit the mold of heroism. The Spartans built a legend around the 300 who died. They built silence around the one who lived. In doing so, they revealed a truth that persists. Societies prefer clean narratives, and survival rarely fits them. Think of how we tell stories of battles. The Alamo in Texas is remembered for those who died, not those who escaped. The charge of the Light Brigade in Crimea is remembered for its futility and its dead, not for those who survived the blunder. Thermopylae is remembered for Leonidas and the fallen, not for Aristodemus. Death creates myth. Survival complicates it. And yet, survival may be the truest form of courage. To live, to endure, to carry memory forward, that is harder than to die in a blaze of glory. Aristodemus lived that truth, even if his society could not accept it. And so did countless others across history. There are even parallels outside of war. Consider survivors of shipwrecks, of plane crashes, of natural disasters. Often they too face suspicion, as though survival implies guilt. Why did you live when others drowned? Why did you escape when others burned? The human mind, searching for fairness in a world without it, turns survival into an accusation. Aristodemus's neighbors in Sparta asked those same silent questions. Survivors today still hear them, sometimes from others, sometimes from within themselves. What binds all of these stories together is the struggle between individual experience and collective narrative. The collective wants heroes, martyrs, clean symbols of sacrifice. The individual lives with mess, with chance, with contradictions. Aristodemus is caught between the two, just as modern survivors are caught between personal trauma and public expectation. This is why remembering Aristodemus matters. He reminds us that survival is not dishonor. It is humanity. He reminds us that the silence imposed on survivors is not inevitable. It is a choice society makes, and one that can be unmade. By telling his story, by acknowledging his pain, We begin to break that silence. And perhaps, in some way, Aristodemus's final act at Plataea was not only about himself. Perhaps it was about forcing his society to remember him not in silence, but in words, not as absence, but as presence. He fought so wildly, so desperately, that he could not be ignored. He demanded, through his death, to be part of the story. And in that, he succeeded. For here we are, more than 2 millennia later, still speaking his name. When we compare him to modern survivors, we see the same pattern. Those who fight to be heard, to be remembered, to have their stories told alongside the neat legends of the dead. Aristodemus is their ancestor, their ancient reflection. His life, with all its flaws and contradictions, is a testament to the universal truth that survival, though messy, is as worthy of remembrance as sacrifice. And so, when you hear of the 300 at Thermopylae, pause and think of the countless others across history who stood in Aristodemus' shoes. The soldier who came home to silence. The survivor who lived when others perished. The human being who carried the unbearable burden of being alive. They, too, deserve a place in memory. They, too, deserve to be remembered not as cowards, but as survivors. From the moment the dust of Thermopylae settled, the battle became more than history.
It became a story, a weapon in the struggle for memory and meaning. The Greeks themselves began this transformation. The death of Leonidas and his men was not recorded only in Herodotus's prose, but inscribed in stone, sung in poetry, carried in oratory. The most famous memorial inscription read, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." With those words, the fallen Spartans became eternal. Their sacrifice crystallized into legend. And yet, in that legend, there was no place for Aristodemus. The inscription speaks of obedience to law, of dying as demanded. Aristodemus did not die at Thermopylae, and so he could not belong to that collective voice. His survival disrupted the clarity of the epitaph, so he was excluded. From the very beginning, the memory of Thermopylae was selective. This selectivity only grew stronger with time. In the decades after the Persian Wars, Thermopylae was invoked as a rallying symbol whenever Greece faced danger. During the Peloponnesian War, both Athens and Sparta used the story for their own purposes. Athens praising the spirit of resistance, Sparta claiming the unique glory of their sacrifice. Each retelling polished the legend further, leaving less and less room for inconvenient details. Aristodemus faded into obscurity, a name whispered only in the margins of Herodotus's work. Centuries later, Rome found inspiration in Thermopylae. Roman writers admired Spartan discipline, and the image of 300 men dying for law and homeland resonated with their own ideals of duty and sacrifice. For the Romans, who cherished stories of Horatius at the bridge or the Decii who devoted themselves to death, Thermopylae became a model of martial virtue. Aristodemus had no role in this Roman imagination. His survival, his shame, his redemption, these did not fit the Roman taste for clean exempla, moral lessons stripped of ambiguity. The Middle Ages, too, remembered Thermopylae in echoes, especially as Europe looked back at antiquity through the lens of Christian martyrdom. The 300 Spartans were cast almost like saints, men who gave their lives for their community. In a culture that prized martyrdom, Aristodemus's survival was again unwelcome. His story did not preach sacrifice, but survival. And survival, in the medieval imagination, carried little sanctity.
The modern era has only amplified this process. In the 19th century, as nationalism swept across Europe, Thermopylae became a potent symbol. Nations struggling for independence or unity pointed to the 300 as models of resistance. Greek revolutionaries against Ottoman rule evoked Leonidas's stand as proof of their heritage. In these narratives, Aristodemus was invisible. His complexity would have weakened the clarity of the symbol, and nationalist movements had no room for nuance. The 20th and 21st centuries have brought Thermopylae into mass culture. Books, films, speeches, all have drawn upon the story. Winston Churchill, during the Second World War, invoked Thermopylae as a symbol of sacrifice against overwhelming odds. The film The 300 Spartans, 1962, presented a noble, almost sanitized version of the battle. More recently, the graphic novel and film 300, 1998-2006, created a hyper-stylized vision of Spartan heroism, where Leonidas and his men embody absolute courage. Once again, Aristodemus is absent. His presence would have disrupted the visual purity of that story. Why is Aristodemus excluded so consistently? The answer lies in the needs of myth. Myths thrive on clarity. They demand heroes and villains, sacrifice and triumph. Aristodemus embodies ambiguity. He survived when others died. He bore shame, then sought redemption. His story cannot be compressed into a single line of dialogue, a single frame of film, a single inscription on stone. He resists simplification, and therefore he resists myth. Yet his absence also reveals something about us. We prefer stories that inspire without complication, stories that comfort us with certainty. Thermopylae as a myth tells us that courage is absolute, that sacrifice is perfect, that some men can be statues of honor. Aristodemus reminds us that courage is messy, that survival is complicated, that men are not statues but flesh and blood. To remember him is to admit that even the greatest legends contain cracks. And perhaps that is why we should insist on remembering him. For history is not only about the stories we polish for inspiration, it is about the truths we preserve for understanding. Aristodemus's life, inconvenient as it is, gives us insight into the human cost of war that myth alone cannot provide. Without him, Thermopylae is marble. With him, Thermopylae is human. His exclusion from popular retellings also raises a question. What do we lose when we silence survivors? We lose complexity. We lose empathy. We lose the chance to understand that survival is not cowardice, but endurance. In forgetting Aristodemus, we risk forgetting that history is not only about those who die, but also about those who live. Imagine, for a moment, a film that told Aristodemus's story. It would not be as visually pure as 300. It would not be as simple as "This is Sparta." But it would be truer, richer, more human. It would show the silence of a city that turned its back, the weight of survivor's guilt, the fury of redemption at Plataea. It would remind us that the real battle is not only against enemies on the field, but against the judgment of society and the burden of memory. In this sense, Aristodemus is not just a missing figure from the Thermopylae myth. He is a mirror held up to the myths themselves. He shows us what they omit, what they simplify, what they erase. His absence is as meaningful as his presence. By asking why Aristodemus is missing, we learn how legends are made, how history is shaped, and how truth is both remembered and forgotten. And so, as Thermopylae continues to inspire politicians, artists, and storytellers, let us remember the silence that surrounds Aristodemus. It is a silence chosen, a silence imposed, but it need not be permanent. By speaking his name, By telling his story, we break that silence. We restore complexity to a legend too often polished smooth. We honor not only the dead who obeyed the laws, but the living who bore their weight. As our journey with Aristodemus draws to a close, let us pause once more at the narrow pass of Thermopylae. Picture it, the mountains closing in, the sea glimmering in the distance, the dust of thousands of Persian feet rising like smoke, and 300 Spartans holding the line. This is the image the world remembers, a wall of bronze, unbroken, fearless, destined for death. But somewhere beyond that wall, there was another figure, a man whose eyes failed him, whose body betrayed him, whose survival would condemn him. Aristodemus. It is tempting, even now, to push him aside, to leave him in the shadows of Leonidas's glory. But to do so is to miss the deeper truth. Thermopylae is not only a story of death, it is also a story of survival.
And survival, though less celebrated, is no less profound. Aristodemus forces us to confront the question at the heart of human history. What does it mean to live when others die? For Sparta, the answer was cruelly simple. To live without dying in battle was to live in shame. But for us, the answer is more complex. To live is to carry memory forward. To live is to bear witness. To live is to remind future generations that courage takes many forms, not only the courage to die, but the courage to endure. We have walked with Aristodemus through silence and shame, through the lonely streets of Sparta where no voice greeted him, no hand reached for his shoulder. We have stood with him on the plain of Plataea, where he fought like a man possessed, where his fury silenced the whispers, if only for a moment, where he found in death the release that life had denied him. And we have seen how his story, inconvenient and uncomfortable, was pushed to the margins of memory, forgotten in the rush to preserve a cleaner legend. But tonight we have chosen to remember him. And in remembering, we restore a piece of the past that makes it whole. Aristodemus is not only a Spartan story, he is a human story. His survival mirrors the experiences of countless others across time. Soldiers who returned from the Somme or Normandy, from Hue or Fallujah, carrying the same burden of guilt. Survivors of disasters who walked away when others did not, who felt the sting of suspicion rather than the comfort of embrace. In Aristodemus, we see them all. He is their ancient reflection, a voice across centuries saying, survival is not shame. Survival is humanity. And yet, his tragedy remains. For he lived in a society that could not see survival as anything but disgrace. Sparta's rigid code left no room for imperfection, no space for chance. Aristodemus's very existence was a challenge to that code, and so he bore the weight of its judgment. Even in death he could not escape the ambiguity. His fury at Plataea was both praised and criticized, both admired and condemned. He was never allowed the simple clarity of hero or coward. He was both and neither. This, I believe, is what makes Aristodemus more powerful than any polished legend. Legends inspire us, yes, but they also distance us. They are statues of marble, cold and perfect, untouchable. Aristodemus is flesh and blood. He stumbles, he falters, he suffers, he rages. He is not marble, he is human. And in that humanity, he comes closer to us than Leonidas ever could. Think of the stories we tell about courage. We prefer the clean ones, the soldier who dies heroically, the leader who sacrifices everything, the martyr who embraces death. But life is rarely clean. More often, it is complicated, messy, uncertain. Aristodemus is the embodiment of that complication. He reminds us that courage is not always about dying bravely. Sometimes it is about living painfully. Sometimes it is about carrying burdens no one else can see. Sometimes it is about fighting again even when your society calls you a coward. In the end, what do we learn from Aristodemus? We learn that honor is not absolute. It is shaped by culture, by expectation, by the stories we choose to tell. Sparta chose to call him a coward. History chose to remember him with unease. But we, here and now, can choose differently. We can choose to see in him not disgrace, but resilience.
Not cowardice, but humanity. And perhaps that is the gift Aristodemus leaves us. He breaks the illusion of perfection and gives us the truth of survival. He shows us that even in the most disciplined, most rigid, most uncompromising society, humanity cannot be erased. One man lived. One man bore the weight. One man forced us to see that legends are built on the backs of flawed, fragile humans. As you drift toward sleep, let his story linger. Remember the silence of Sparta, the fury of Plataea, the ambiguity of a life caught between shame and redemption. Remember that Aristodemus was not marble, not myth, but a man who lived and died like so many others, messily, imperfectly, profoundly human. And if you take anything from his story, let it be this. When you think of courage, do not think only of the clean sacrifices that become legends. Think also of the survivors, the ones who carry the heavy burden of memory. Their stories, like Aristodemus's, are no less worthy of honor. Thank you, dear friends, for walking this journey with me tonight. If you have found in Aristodemus's story something that speaks to you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments, to let us know what part of his tale resonated most. And if you would like to hear more stories like this, from the shadows of history where the human heart beats beneath the armor of myth, I welcome you to subscribe and join us again. For now, let the tale of Aristodemus rest with you, a reminder that survival is not shame, but a form of courage in itself. Good night, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep.